Oh no, Trump the dictator is taking away the Department of Education. Let me tell you what that means before you freak out, and it's actually not bad at all.
No, it's bad. Let's dive in, shall we?
To start it off, the Department of Education actually wasn't put in place until 1979. It's fairly new, and the U.S. has done just fine without it before, so.
Okay, the Department of Education was created because, no, things were not fine. Schools didn't even start including students with disabilities until the federal government stepped in. So if by fine you mean kids getting wildly different educations depending on their race or income level or if they're disabled or not, sure. But if you care about equal opportunity, then the Department of Education is essential.
Also, the U.S. spends about $18,000 a year, give or take, on each pupil per year. But yet, we're ranked 12th in education, which is horrible.
I don't know where you're getting that figure from because per pupil spending varies wildly in our country. Most of the funding comes from property taxes. That's why wealthier neighborhoods get wealthier schools. That's why federal funds are so critical. They help level the playing field. And countries that beat us in rankings don't just throw money at education. They respect teachers. They have a whole system that respects public education.
So, here are some of his plans to make it better. Schooling will no longer be controlled by the federal government. It'll be controlled by the states. I would say that's way better because local communities know more about their kids than the federal government does. For example, I live in a state where a lot of people's first language is Spanish, not English. Now we're able to cater to those kids.
States might know their communities well, but that does not mean that they're going to prioritize every student equally or protect every student's rights. If we lose the Department of Education, oversight for English language learners is going to be a massive loss. There's even an entire office of civil rights within the Department of Education that will handle things like discrimination. And in states that don't respect bilingual education or immigration in general, or they might have English only rules in their school that are really harmful to ELs, they are going to be unchecked without the Department of Education. In general, it's worth noting that before the Department of Education, many states did not prioritize students with additional needs. This is why we have laws like IDEA for students with disabilities and why we have Title I funding for low-income schools. These programs literally came from the federal government because states weren't filling those gaps on their own.
Teachers will be paid on a merit system, meaning if that teacher has an advanced degree, they will get paid more.
That's not what a merit system is. Merit system is a system where teachers' salaries or bonuses are based on their performances. Ooh, by the way.
And if a teacher would like to continue their education, they will also get paid more.
What you're describing literally already happens. I mean, districts will often not hire highly qualified teachers with many degrees if they want to save a buck, but salary schedules with bumps for additional degrees and credits are a thing pretty widely.
No more districting schools. So that means if the school in your district is ghetto,
okay, let's not say that word,
and it sucks and it's trashy, your kids don't have to go there and you don't have to move to get them to go to another school. You can pick wherever you want them to go. This will make the schools more competitive.
And there's no transportation provided for that. So your idea is to make parents lug their kids to schools outside of their area and turn those schools into little Hunger Game arenas competing for resources. This literally only benefits wealthy families who can afford the luxury of choice. Federal oversight is in place because we know that without it, lower income and rural schools suffer. Look at places with broad school choice programs like Arizona and Florida. We've seen schools losing funding and even facing closure while private schools are under little to no accountability to meet quality standards.
Because schools get funded by how many kids are going to their school.
Funding in the United States comes from things like property taxes, state contributions, and federal funding. Most of a school's budget depends on their local property taxes, which means that the wealth of the surrounding area plays a huge role in their funding. Schools with wealthy areas get more money. So that's why federal and state funds exist to balance out some of this. But even with this support, poorer districts are often left underfunded. You're missing a big part of the picture here.
He wants to restore American pride back into the classroom.
Okay.
Meaning the kids will be saying the Pledge of Allegiance and U.S. history will be taught, no matter what, the good and the bad, all of it.
So let's say you have a liberal city, let's Los Angeles, San Diego, and they just decide we're going to get rid of that history. We got new history. This is America built off the backs of slaves on stolen land. And that curriculum comes in.
Then we don't send them money.
Lastly, there will be a reward-based system funded by the states for the counties. Meaning if a school does good or bad, they will receive more or less funding depending on what they're doing.
So you want No Child Left Behind again? Because we've tried this before with No Child Left Behind. And it was a freaking disaster. Children were left behind. They're behind. I get that sounds good to you, but it's going to punish schools that already need extra support, and we've already done it, and we've already gotten rid of it in 2015.
For example, if a school were to implement things to make school a safer place for all people, they would get more funding for that. But they would lose funding for talking about politics or pushing religion on children. But children will be allowed to pray. So you cannot tell a kid, no, you cannot pray, you cannot practice your religion in school. You just can't force it on somebody else. And there has to be parent permission before anybody talks about trans ideologies to those kids, or else that school could lose funding completely.
So students can pray freely, but topics like their identity are off limits. Okay, that's a form of censorship. I thought you guys really hate that. I guess you want the discrimination that comes with eliminating the Department of Education. The people yearn for oppressing minority groups. Some people.
Sorry that video was kind of long, but if I missed anything, do not be afraid to point it out. We all need to learn about this. Sorry that video was kind of long, but if I missed anything, do not be afraid to point it out.
Hope that helps!
So Trump just released a video announcing that one of the first things he wants to do when he gets in office is closing the Department of Education in Washington, D.C. and putting all of the education responsibilities back to the states. He said that this will better be able to meet the needs locally to those separate jurisdictions and those areas.
Okay, leaving education up to the states alone might sound like good in theory. Let's look at desegregation. A lot of states resisted integrating schools. Some even shut down public schools just to avoid it. It took federal involvement to enforce desegregation and push for fairer treatment. Federal guidelines are there to set standards, but without the Department of Education, states could decide on their own rules. I don't want to leave states to their own devices because 17 states allow corporal punishment in public schools. 46 states allow it in private schools. I don't want them left to their own devices. I think they make silly choices that are harmful to students.
He also said that we spend about 3 times as much than any other nation on individual pupils, yet we are behind in a lot of nations, and you have to admit that's pretty unacceptable.
No, Luxembourg spends the most per pupil, but whatever, who cares? Spending alone doesn't tell the whole story. In the United States, per pupil spending changes a lot from place to place, and other countries with stronger education outcomes tend to fund education more evenly than we do, because here, school funding mostly comes from property taxes. And the Department of Education helps bridge the gaps between wealthy and poor areas by sending dollars to communities that don't have as much money. This concept is called equity, and it makes sure that resources go where they're needed most, instead of assuming that every community has equal resources to begin with and giving them the same amount of money.
If you look back at why the Department of Education was created in Washington, D.C. in the first place, it was created so that access to education, funding, all of that would be allocated evenly and equally among everyone. So you wouldn't have all of the funding going to higher income areas. It would be equally funded for everyone. Well, now that's just not the case.
You're halfway there. Before the department existed, education quality was really, really uneven, and schools in wealthy areas had a lot more teachers and updated books and better schools. Schools that were in poorer areas often went without. In the 1960s and 70s, schools serving low-income communities had overcrowded classrooms, outdated books, and fewer teachers. And side note, I think that a lot of people think when I say overcrowded or underfunded schools that it means like a city school or urban schools. I just want to call out that poor schools means rural schools too. 63% of public schools receive Title I funding. That certainly means the majority of schools in the United States are in some way underfunded. The Department of Education was created to promote fairness in education, but it was also designed to protect students' rights. So the department actually has its own Office of Civil Rights. This is really important in states that have patchy civil rights records or don't offer inclusive education. So we can't cut the department and expect these states to just magically protect all students when states are passing laws that restrict discussions of things like LGBTQIA+ issues, or saying that enslaved people's experiences were somehow positive in the South, or states that are just really excited to deport all immigrants. What about the English language learners there? What about disabled students literally everywhere?
Now, some of the schools that have the most funding are some of the schools that are underperforming the most. Some of the schools that are in the lowest income area are the schools that most of this funding is going to. So it's clearly not working the way that we're doing it as it is right now.
I assume you're referring to Title I funds that are given to schools to try and close funding gaps. Because remember, because school funding in the United States mostly comes from local property taxes, that means that the wealth of a community affects the schools there and how much money they get. State legislatures and school boards use different funding formulas to decide what money goes where, and this won't change if the Department of Education is closed, but the oversight will be gone. I know I keep saying that, but mind you, the funding formulas vary state by state. The government, the federal government, through the Department of Education, funds 8 to 10% of these state education departments. So if we take that 8 to 10% away, they're going to have to make up that gap somewhere, and it's going to come from slashing school programs or raising taxes like property or income or sales tax.
I'm a fan of this. Let me know what you think about defunding the Department of Education in Washington, D.C.
That's what I think.
That doesn't mean that we won't have public schools, but that means that that centralized entity will not exist, and the states will make decisions how their funding and how their schooling is allocated.
Public schools would certainly continue without the Department of Education as long as they aren't driven to closure thanks to things like school vouchers and school choice, and they are not underfunded. But okay, every public school would lose that federal oversight that I keep talking about. That's what provides consistency across states. Do you support our troops? Because those kids move a lot. This isn't just about consistency in funding state to state, but also anti-discrimination protection. Today, the Department of Education has 17 departments that are highly specialized, and they are not scattered into random other government agencies like they were before. The Department of Education helps maintain a consistent standard. It's not just about money, it's about a lot more than that.
So there's a bunch of people out there freaking out that Donald Trump wants to get rid of the Department of Education, but I wonder if they know that before we had a Department of Education, the United States had the best school systems in the world.
In the 60s and 70s, there were no global rankings as we know them today. In fact, the first conversations around global rankings were started during the Cold War by politicians, which is similar to kind of what you're doing right now, I think. But at the time, we did have a couple international studies, like the International Math Study and the International Science Study. Those showed US students doing fine. Like, not the best, but fine. We were average in math, below average in advanced topics like algebra and geometry, and we were decent in science, but countries like Japan and the Soviet Union constantly outperformed us.
And now we're ranked 24th.
I mean, it depends who you ask. I don't know what you're looking at or who you're repeating, but it's hard to say actually because every state has its own Department of Education that runs things differently. So whatever rank you're seeing is an average anyways.
It's almost like sometimes if you want to make progress, you got to go back to doing things that actually worked.
I'm the first to say that there is room for improvement, believe me. But blaming every single issue on the Department of Education when they don't even set curriculum nationwide is silly goose behavior. The real issues are underfunding, teacher shortages, and systemic inequality, not the fact that there's a federal agency coordinating efforts.